war wasn't just about emancipation. It was about control, global, financial, and political, engineered by a hidden hand pulling strings from across the Atlantic.
Guys, just a quick message before this video starts. So there's levels to this thing, and this is going to shock you, but if you want to go to the next level after you watch this, I started something called the Forbidden Book Society. So that's where I get all the research for putting these episodes together. Obviously, I can only put a small percentage of what I retain and what I learned from these books into this episode. If you want to know the full story of this, check out the Forbidden Book Society below. If you're a curious, obsessed researcher like myself, check out the Forbidden Book Society. Love you. Back to the video. Thank you for watching.
The Rothschilds caused the Civil War. What? No, I thought slavery caused the Civil War. Think again. Pick up in 1837. By this time, everybody knew about the Rothschilds, and America was especially skittish in regard to any type of mention of the Rothschilds being involved in anything to do with their daily lives. So the Rothschilds were like, okay, they're on to us. We have to start having frontmen. So this guy named August Belmont arrives in New York, 1837, and he's a financial agent of the Rothschilds, and he's used as a mechanism to invest in America and shift capital into America without paper trail connecting it to the Rothschilds. So yeah, they're trying to counter the rising anti-Rothschild sentiment prevalent from both Europe and America. So the Rothschilds, through their agent August Belmont, were consolidating their industrial holdings in the U.S. and buying up Southern bonds at a fraction of their value, hoping to profit by forcing the Union to honor the South's pre-war debts after the war. Belmont also became the chief agent for the sale of Union bonds in England and France. Now, something that must be mentioned, the Knights of the Golden Circle. The Knights of the Golden Circle was a secret organization aiming for revolution and conquest, founded by George W.L. Bickley. It drew memberships from the Masonic lodges and had connections with the French Illuminati branch called the Seasons. Let's see how good your memory is. Who were we talking about the last time we spoke about Masonic lodges and the French Illuminati? There you go. So Bickley became the head of the Confederate Secret Service, and the Golden Knights spread throughout the border in southern states. In the North, they sought to seize political power to overthrow Lincoln, playing a significant role in organizing anti-draft riots. So there you go. They're agents of chaos. So in the South, the Knights aimed to extend slavery by conquering Mexico and establishing a Mexican-American empire as a counter to the North. Their name symbolized this goal, with boundaries forming a circle from Cuba to Pennsylvania and Panama. 1863, the Knights of the Golden Circle were reorganized as the Order of American Knights. A year later, they became known as Order of the Sons of Liberty, with an estimated membership of between 200,000 and 300,000. After the Civil War, the group went further underground, and remnants eventually emerged as the KKK. The reason I bring that group up is because there's some connections between this group and the Rothschilds, and this group was one of the leading factors in inciting the South to go to war with the North. The public eventually discovered that Belmont was an agent of the Rothschilds, and you know who they replaced him with? A guy named J.P. Morgan. You might have heard of him. The name that's slapped on the biggest bank in America today. Isn't that something? Before we get into this, here's what Otto von Bismarck said about Abraham Lincoln after he died. Quote, "The death of Lincoln was a disaster for Christendom. There was no man in the United States great enough to wear his boots, and the bankers went anew to grab the riches. I fear that foreign bankers, with their craftiness and torturous tricks, will entirely control the exuberant riches of America and use it to systematically corrupt civilization." Dramatic. So dissolving a central bank is not all butterflies and rainbows. By 1837, 1 year after the bank is eliminated, the U.S. was at the tail end of an economic boom, mostly fueled by the central bank, because the amount of money in circulation had increased by 84% in just 4 years. That's an economic boom. Again, even more than COVID in terms of percentage increase. So it was inevitable that there was going to be a severe contraction, especially when you eliminate the ability to create new money. So within 1 year of eliminating the central bank, 16% of the nation's money supply just disappeared. So obviously this was economically devastating. Unemployment, bankruptcies, lost homes, lost savings, protests. So Congress is going crazy trying to propose solutions to alleviate this. There was a good amount of turbulence between 1837 and the start of the Civil War, and a lot more of what led up to the war can be attributed to economics rather than anything to do with slavery. This might be controversial to say, but the Civil War is caused by economics, not slavery. So the North was driven by industrial prosperity and saw slavery as a moral issue, while the South was more of an agrarian economy and depended on human labor. This might shock you, but during Lincoln's 1860 presidential campaign, he said that his goal was to preserve the Union, not necessarily to end slavery. He said that if preserving the Union meant keeping slavery, that he would do so. Yikes. So the conflict between the North and South was really exasperated by these protectionist tariffs imposed by the federal government, which favored northern manufacturers at the expense of the southern economy. The tariffs forced the South to buy more expensive northern goods instead of cheaper European products, leading to what many southern states saw as legalized plunder. So one of the biggest things that contributed to the Civil War was that the North had far more seats in Congress, and they were putting in these tariffs that prohibited the South from buying cheap goods that were made from Europe, because Europe was more industrially developed than the North, and they were able to sell goods more cheaply, the way that China is able to sell electric vehicles more cheaply than the United States because they have a bigger manufacturing base and they got ahead of it with the subsidies and everything. But this is a real paradox, because a lot of people would argue that it's necessary to have tariffs to prevent your country from buying things cheaper from another country when you're trying to develop your industrial base, because businesses in the North can't survive if they're being undersold by further developed industrial bases in Europe. So these tariffs forced the South to buy more expensive northern goods instead of cheaper European products, leading to what many southern states saw as legalized plunder. So with this tension, Europe smelled blood in the water. There's this thing called the Mexico and Monroe Doctrine. So France, Spain, and England were all plotting and planning to take control over Latin American markets, with Mexico being its prized possession in its eyes. But there's a thing called the Monroe Doctrine, where it had been declared that European interference in American markets would not be tolerated in an effort to prevent colonizing in the Americas. So of course, European powers, especially England and France, supported Confederacy, hoping that a divided United States would be easier to control. They viewed America's success as a threat to European aristocracies and saw the Civil War as an opportunity to undermine it. And boom! The Rothschild connection. So Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, suggested that European bankers, and the Rothschilds in particular, wanted to divide the United States into two weaker democracies to maintain financial dominion. Shocker. The financiers encouraged North-South divide, exploiting the slavery issue as a means to drive the conflict. So here was the European strategy. France, shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War, France landed troops in Mexico and installed Ferdinand Maximilian as a puppet emperor by 1864. Then England moved 11,000 troops into Canada, threatening the Union from the north, while also putting the British fleet on wartime alert. So the European powers were outright planning to create a new order in the Americas that would be dominated by the financial power of the Rothschilds, ensuring influence over the divided United States. So there's a crazy amount of things that nobody knows about the Civil War. That, for example, Lincoln was having a really difficult time getting people to fight for the North at the beginning of it, because they were just like, all right, I'm not going to risk my life to try to keep the Union intact. That's not a compelling enough issue for me. So he started drafting people. There started to be protests. There was a protest in New York on Madison Square. People were protesting against the war. People were mowed down in the streets. It's actually, I believe, what the movie Gangs of New York was based on. So Lincoln did some really aggressive shit against he drafting people, shooting them for protesting in the war. Serious stuff. So he eventually converted the war into a anti-slavery crusade with the Emancipation Proclamation, issued without constitutional authority, as a military strategy to reignite support for what had been which has been perceived as a rich man's war, poor man's fight. This proclamation is not an amendment, not an act of Congress. It was an order directly from Lincoln as commander-in-chief. It declared freedom for slaves only in areas where the Union had no control, while allowing slavery to continue in loyal border states. Impact on the war and international support. So despite its limited practical effect, the proclamation shifted morale focus of the war and ultimately helped doom the Confederacy by preventing European intervention, as countries like England and France could not openly support a nation defending slavery without facing backlash from their own citizens. Something else that never gets spoken about is that Russia actually came to the defense of the United States. So Russia, vehemently opposed to the central banking powers, they saw what was happening. They saw the European central bankers were closing in on the United States. And the Tsar said, Lincoln, we've got your back. Tell us what you need. The Russian Navy posted up on the east coast of the United States and prevented England and France from rolling up on the shores of the United States during the Civil War. You can look this up. Russia defended America's shores from England and France intervention during the Civil War. Never gets spoken about, and in large part due to hatred for central bankers. because they were predatory. Raising armies on both sides, how'd they do it? So to raise an army, bounties and conscriptions were used. States, townships, counties, they used an elaborate system to offer men up to $1,000, which is the equivalent of $60,000 today, to join the army. And of course, wealthy people were able to avoid the draft by paying a fee or hiring substitutes. Now in the South, the Confederacy centralized its government by passing a conscription law that gave the Confederate president control over all males between age 18 and 35. Wealthy landowners could avoid service if they owned 20 slaves, though many did not use this loophole as they saw themselves as defending their homes and families. So, as I said, rebelling in the North, opposition to the conscription. When Lincoln initiated the conscription in 1863, it triggered public outrage, especially in New York. Anti-draft riots escalated with buildings set ablaze, and the Army of the Potomac was ordered to suppress riots, resulting in over 1,000 civilian deaths or injuries. This is what I talked about in Madison Square, New York. 1,000 civilian deaths or injuries. Go watch Gangs of New York with Leonardo DiCaprio. I believe that's this exact situation that movie's about. So Lincoln also suspended civil liberties. To manage the growing insurrection, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, allowing the government to imprison critics without formal charges or trial. This move resulted in the mass imprisonment of Northern dissenters, further igniting public anger. So Lincoln kind of went into dictator mode a little bit here. We don't talk about that. Now, the funding of the war. Obviously, this was a hefty bill. And no central bank. And you can't really have a good war without a central bank and the ability to print an endless amount of money. So what'd they do? Legend has it August Belmont approached Lincoln and offered a line of credit to the North for the war effort at 27% interest. And the story goes, he was aggressively thrown out of the office. Well, this might just be what got Lincoln killed. So the federal government's expenses rose dramatically from $67 million in 1861 to $1.3 billion in 1865. So what's that? That's like 15x? 4 years. The government's expenses increased 15x. And taxes only covered like 11% of the cost. So the government obviously resorted to heavy borrowing, pushing the war deficit to $2.61 billion. So this was the first time income tax was ever used in the United States. It was implemented during the Civil War, and some argue it's a violation of the Constitution. No, it was definitely a small tax by today's standards. Back then, though, when men actually had testosterone, it was highly unpopular, and Congress feared additional taxes would provoke a rebellion again, back when the majority of men actually had testosterone and would put their foot down about something. Challenges with the war financing. So obviously, if you want a war, a good war, you gotta have a central bank, but the central bank was gone. So state banks were jumping up and down, super eager, chomping at the bit to take on the role, but they couldn't even fulfill their gold obligations. So it was unreliable and unrealistic for them to do even more lending because they had nothing to back it up. I mean, just like today, but that's complicated. Different topic for another day. So here we go. The thing that most likely got Lincoln killed, the greenbacks. In 1862, Congress authorized the printing of $150 million in greenbacks, a new form of fiat currency, declared legal tender for private debts, but not for government taxes or duties. By the end of the war, a total of $432 million in greenbacks had been issued. Now, despite constitutional concerns, greenbacks were justified as a war necessity. Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, who initially supported them, later declared them unconstitutional when peace returned. Here's what Lincoln thought about money creation. Lincoln supported the issuance of greenbacks, arguing that the government should create and issue currency without borrowing from banks. Ding, ding, ding. This is the mindset that got Lincoln killed, unfortunately. Lincoln believed that this was the government's supreme prerogative in a way to avoid paying interests to private banks. So Lincoln initially supported banks. He was a proponent of easy credit, and as a member of the Whig Party in the 30s, he advocated for the reestablishment of the Second Bank of the United States, but his perspective shifted, and he became critical of the banking industry's role in issuing fiat money. So he saw the evils of this stuff. He saw what compounding interest does to you. Like, you ever see people who are paying off student debt, or people who are paying off mortgage? Like, there's these great charts that show here. I'll pop one up here that shows what you pay in the principal and what you pay in interest over the course of time. And like for the first 20 years of a mortgage or of student debt, you're paying like 90% interest, 10% principal. You end up paying for the thing twice. Same thing for car loans. So when people see 3 to 5% interest, they're like, oh yeah, that's not that crazy. But if you look at the breakdown of the way that your bill is structured, you end up paying for the item twice. And it's not an accident that they don't teach you that in school. They don't like those charts. So the bankers deplored these greenbacks. It was a horrifying notion to them because it denied them profits from the government debt with the juiciest profits of them all. And they were strongly advocating to replace federal fiat money with bank fiat money, which would necessitate the creation of a new monetary system based on government bonds. So Secretary Chase worked towards this goal of returning to central banking. All right, very important. So this act is still in use today. Now, wasn't a bad idea. It's actually very functional, but also has a lot of problems. So the National Banking Act passed February 1863, created a new system of nationally chartered banks. Unlike the Central Bank of the United States, the system allowed many national banks, all regulated by Washington rather than a single central entity. So the objective was to raise funds for military expenses by creating a market for government bonds, which would be converted into circulating money. So here's how it worked. When a national bank bought government bonds, it would exchange them with the Treasury for an equal amount of United States banknotes. These notes were declared legal tender for taxes and duties, but were not classified as lawful money for all debts. The bank received interest in the bonds and the newly issued banknotes, doubling its income without increasing its capital. So basically, to put this simply, typically the bank has $100 in gold reserves back in this time, could lend out $1,000 maybe in paper money loans. So the gold is the collateral, but this established a system where the act of the bank purchasing a government bond made the government bond the collateral. So if the bank buys $100 worth of bonds, that's $100 worth of collateral in the eyes of the system. So they could then lend out an amount of money equal or in slight excess to the value of the bonds they have. So prior to this, the amount of money that a bank could lend out depended on how much cash they had or how much gold they had. That was their collateral. But there's a finite amount of cash and a finite amount of gold, but there's no limit to the amount of government debt you could have. So gave the banks the ability to buy debt, buy bonds from the government, have that as collateral, lend out money based on that. I hope I explained that well enough for you to understand. This system is still very much in use today. They actually call government bonds, U.S. Treasuries, the tier 1 pristine capital in the world. It's the highest grade collateral that you could have as a bank, even higher than gold. U.S. Treasuries, higher than gold in terms of collateral. Topic for another day. Any of these things, fire off in the comments. Tell me if you want to know more about them. This is the turning point where we establish a system where the federal government could never fully repay its debt. You ever see they say something like 99% of the money supply is debt? This is what they're talking about. So it created the system where if the government paid off all of its debt, the money, the actual cash, which is backed by government bonds, would disappear, destroying the money supply. So that's why people get confused when I say paying off debt is the destruction of money inside the money supply. I know, trippy, counterintuitive, but that's the way it is. So it created the situation where infinite perpetual debt was necessary for the continuation of the national banking system. Yeah, disaster. Economist John Galbraith said if the government had paid off its debt after the war, it would have eliminated the backing for national banknotes, disrupting the entire money supply. Yeah, that's a depressing one. So let's see, how bad did inflation get during the Civil War? So there was a 65% drop in the value of greenbacks, the money supply increasing by 138%, prices doubled while wages increased by less than half, causing citizens to lose more than half their earnings or savings through inflation. In the South, inflation was crazy, like hyperinflation. Confederate money and state-issued notes caused prices to rise by 9,000%. And by the end of the war, these notes were worthless. The saddest thing about all of this, and it's kind of crazy, is that most citizens didn't realize that the increased money supply represented a hidden tax. I mean, just like COVID, when people are like, oh yeah, woohoo, I'm gonna get my stimmy. Bro, you're gonna be at a net loss by the time you spend your stimmy. How's your stimmy treating you now? Quick $1,500 one-time payment, and boom, lose half your purchasing power permanently. Don't want to insult 80% of the population, but it seems like more than 50% of the population still doesn't understand that the stimulus checks were a net negative for them. The inflation tax is paid by the public through higher prices, allowing the government to fund the war without open taxation. Citizens even applauded Congress for the banking measures, unaware that they were effectively paying for the war through inflation. So you thought the Rothschilds didn't have any part in this? Listen, Lincoln doesn't understand this shit. He had no idea what the National Banking Act was going to do, what the ramifications of it were going to be. But here's a letter from the Rothschilds gleefully celebrating the National Banking Act. Quote, the few who understand the system bank loans earning interest and also serving as money will either be so interested in its profits or so dependent upon its favors that there will be no opposition from that class, while on the other hand, the great body of people mentally incapable of comprehending will bear its burdens without complaint. That's going to cut deep for a lot of people, if you can comprehend what they're saying right there, which I hope the majority of you can. So Lincoln felt really bad about this, actually. He was deeply concerned about the implications of the National Banking Act, but refrained from vetoing it because of party loyalty and he needed to maintain the war in his eyes. So here's what Lincoln said in a letter to one of his buddies, quote, "The money power preys upon the nation in times of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, and more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until the wealth is aggregated into a few hands and the republic destroyed." So despite a ton of pressure, Lincoln opposed the call for economic vengeance in the South after the war. He vetoed the Wade Davis Emancipation Bill because it would have placed a lien on Southern cotton to benefit Northern manufacturers and pay off Southern debts, benefiting speculators like Rothschild's agent August Belmont. So the Rothschilds were banking on the South to win. That's why they were buying up all those Southern bonds for pennies on the dollar. But those were all, of course, worthless when the South lost. So here's how the Lincoln assassination went down. Very weird thing about Lincoln's assassination. So there's a legend out there that says potentially John Wilkes Booth was not killed in the barn, but he was allowed to escape, and that the body was the body of an accomplice. And this theory states that the War Secretary Edwin Stanton and the government covered up these facts, this evidence. So a lot of people thought this was crazy at first, but the War Department files were declassified in the 1930s, and historians were actually shocked by evidence that gave some credibility to this legend. Otto Eisenhelm was the first to delve into these records, publishing Why Lincoln Was Murdered in 1937. The most comprehensive account came from Theodore Roscoe 20 years later, who revealed startling conclusions from these hidden files. So contrary to popular belief, Booth was not merely a stereotypical villain, and the assassination was not fully avenged. Roscoe suggests that Lincoln's death was a criminal conspiracy where the true culprits escaped justice. So the granddaughter of John Wilkes Booth made a crazy discovery related to her grandfather. So in her book, This One Mad Fact, she recounts finding secret records of the Knights of the Golden Circle. These documents had been sealed and classified by Secretary Stanton and stored in a government vault for decades, and no one had been allowed to access them. But due to her lineage and credentials, she was eventually granted access to the package, and she described her experience examining these contents, including documents, articles, and even flakes of the bone from the assassin. She recognized her grandfather's connection to the Knights of the Golden Circle and confirmed Booth's involvement with secret society. So his granddaughter's grandmother, which I suppose would have been his wife, if I'm reading this correctly, revealed that Booth had been, quote, the tool of other men. So obviously that raises the question, who was really behind Lincoln's assassination? Was it leaders of the Knights of the Golden Circle? Was it European bankers and financiers? Or was it conspirators within Lincoln's own party? You know, we don't want to go around and speculate, but there's clear evidence that Secretary of War Stanton and powerful forces within the federal government worked to conceal evidence and end the investigation swiftly, protecting certain individuals from accountability. Well, just 30 years prior to this, pretty similar thing happened to Andrew Jackson, and I'll let you make your own conclusions, but this one's worth a deeper look, and I'm sure there's evidence out there to show which one of these is most likely.